Big news, big news. The study found their genetic profiles looked most like those of prehistoric inhabitants of Sicily.
Really? No, really.
I was right. My video on Hannibal, ancestry and all that, and I said I was right. Boom, Brown University.
I've got a hot one for you today, and I need you to listen closely. We're talking about a Nature paper. Yes, Nature, the big deal journal, that just dropped a bombshell titled Punic People Were Genetically Diverse, with almost no Levantine ancestors. This study, with authors from Harvard and Max Planck, the academic elite, you know the type, claims that the people of ancient Carthage and its colonies had almost zero blood from their Phoenician homeland. According to them, these so-called Punic folks were basically a mix of local Mediterranean stock, mostly like Sicilians and other Europeans, plus just a dash of North African. Sounds tidy, right? Almost too tidy. Well, you guys know me, and this story just doesn't add up. Today I'm going to deconstruct this paper claim by claim. But more than that, I'm going to shine a light on what they conveniently ignored, or deliberately didn't say. Namely, the Black African origins of Carthage and the Phoenicians. Because what we have here is a classic case of mainstream academia spinning a narrative that downplays Africa's role. By the end of this, you'll be questioning everything about how they did this study, what they chose to leave out, and why they might be doing it. Boy, you're gonna love this. They try to cover themselves, of course. Buried in the text, they caution that by labeling sites and people as Punic, they're not denying the Levantine cultural origins of the founders. Oh no, they'd never do that, and they flat out acknowledge they do not have the early samples needed to address whether places like Carthage and Cádiz were founded by Levantines, so they know they lack the data on the early years. But does that stop them from making eye-grabbing conclusions? Not one bit. The title of the paper doesn't say, after 600 BCE, Punic people had little Levantine ancestry. It just declares Punic people had almost no Levantine ancestors. Period. Full stop. The casual reader, the media, YouTubers, they all take that as Carthaginians weren't related to Phoenicians, which is exactly how it's being spun. And your regular African history deniers like Metatron are on this already claiming victory, and I told you so. And it gets even better, or worse. What if I told you some of the people they did include weren't even from Carthaginian times at all? They folded in 20 individuals from sites like Sicily, Sardinia, and Iberia that date to periods of Roman control. Yes, you heard right. Roman era, folks living in formerly Punic towns. Why on earth are those in a study about Punic genetics? Supposedly they're there as a comparison, but come on, it muddies the waters. The only 3 ancient individuals in the entire Punic dataset who showed any substantial Levantine ancestry were 2 from Sicily and 1 from Sardinia. And the kicker is that those 2 Sicilian samples date squarely in the period of Roman rule. In other words, they might not even be Punic-era colonists. They could be later migrants or mercenaries with Levantine roots during Roman times. The authors admit this detail in passing, but do they highlight it in their conclusions? Of course not. It's another dodge. If something might contradict the no Levantine ancestry narrative, explain it away by saying, oh, those were during Roman control, not representative. Meanwhile, use the absence of Levantine DNA in the actual Carthaginian-era samples from after 600 BCE to loudly proclaim almost no ancestors from the Levant. Oh, by the way, when we read these papers, we have to be very careful because there is another trick they use. When they say no Levantine DNA, which Levantine are they talking about? Present-day Levantine who are really Arabo-Persians, at least in the region of Lebanon and Tyre. Or are they talking about pre-Persian invasion Levantine, who we know are black, and the same stock as ancient Egypt? Or better yet, are they talking about Neolithic Levantine, who we know are black Natufians, that progressively merged with the Nubio-Kemetic stock, black people, well before the arrival of the Arabs? Which one are they talking about? It is very important to know, and they have the responsibility to clarify. Think about the timeline here, folks. 146 BCE. That's when Rome obliterated Carthage in the Third Punic War, the end of Hannibal's people as a sovereign nation. The city is destroyed, population decimated. I won't dwell on this too much, but the Romans engaged in complete eradication of anything Carthaginian after the war. The people, the art, the buildings, they destroyed it all. Any remains from after that date in Carthage would be Roman colonists or others, effectively a new population. The paper's main sample set goes up to the 2nd century BCE, so around and just after that fall. If you scoop up bones from Carthage dated, say, 100 BCE, you're not getting Hannibal's great-grandpa. You're getting somebody who might be a Roman settler, or a mix of whoever moved in post-conquest. It's ridiculous to use that to infer who the pre-Roman Carthaginians were. Yet this study lumps together all these Punic contexts, people, and then draws a broad conclusion about all Punic people. Data dodge, timeline dodge, call it what you want. And this long list of, quote, professionals, didn't notice this? Give me a break. Before we move on, let's underline why this first chapter of Carthage's story is so crucial, not just for getting the Levantine influence right, but for understanding Carthage's African identity. Those earliest settlers from Tyre and Sidon, Levantine Phoenicians, weren't some generic Middle Easterners as modern folks might imagine. Ancient texts and evidence suggest they carried a heavy African imprint, culturally and even physically. The Phoenicians themselves, in their own records and legends, claimed they originally came from the Nile-Valley. I'm not kidding. Texts found at Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit, imply the Phoenicians traced their origins back to ancient Egypt, the Nubio-Kemetic civilization. We did a video on the true Phoenician origins. Go check it out. Really everything from their religion, to their gods, to the writing, to their mathematics, their technology, and their rulers were black Africans. And there is so much art from early Phoenicia that is clearly black African that is never shown. Oh yes, they did the same thing a few months ago when they wrote a paper on the Nuerat man, trying to imply that he was Levantine. In a previous video, we used their own data to break down all their argument and pseudo-arguments on Nuerat. By the way, if you haven't already, you should really check out King's monologue and Comjiver's breakdown on this. They go into detail about why that paper was a travesty. Even Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that the Phoenicians themselves said they migrated from the shores of the Red Sea down south before settling in the Levant. In other words, the Phoenicians saw themselves as a people who came out of Africa. Their writing was a derivative of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Their religion drew from Egyptian gods, and their earliest appearance, their phenotype, was described and depicted as black African. This is critical. If those founding Carthaginians were Phoenicians from the Levant, who were in turn of African, Egyptian, Nubian heritage, then Carthage's rootstock was already African before they even left the Levant. But the paper's dataset conveniently starts after those folks were gone. By dodging the founding era, the study doesn't just miss Levantine genes, it misses the African genes that Levantine Phoenicians likely brought. How convenient for them, and how disgraceful for truth. If you thought this was bad, wait till you see what they did next. But before this, let me give a big shout out to some random supporters of the channel. Big shout out to Kadir, the Oba, Jim Butts, today's Ashanti Heaney, Edward Fisher, one of the OG, a true king of Tyre, and Yvette, the queen of Manarinas herself. Shout out to 2Bez294 and Showman Coffee for their supporting comment on Arthur Ashe's video. Now let's tackle what I call the Sicilian smokescreen, the way this study emphasizes certain ancestries to cloud the picture. Here's their big finding in a nutshell. Ancient Punic populations, Carthage and its sister cities, supposedly got the majority of their genetic ancestry from people who looked like ancient Sicilians and Aegean islanders, not from Levantine Phoenicians. The authors go on and on about this. They say the Punic expansion was driven by Aegean-like people, that the dominant ancestry in their data matches Bronze Age Aegean and Sicilian samples. They even speculate that maybe Phoenicians intermarried with indigenous Sicilians early on, or that there was gene flow from Greek colonies into Punic towns. In plain language, they're painting a picture that Carthaginians were basically Euro-Mediterranean colonials. Culturally, Phoenician perhaps, but by blood more akin to Italians or Greeks. And the Levantine, Middle Eastern input? Shrug, negligible. African input? Oh, just a minority everywhere. even in Carthage itself.
One in Egypt, this skeleton dated approximately 20,000 years before Christ. The wide nasal aperture, lower nasal margin morphology, presence of the sulcus praenasalis, wide interorbital distance and alveolar prognatism demonstrate affinities with broad African variants. All of the great anthropologists, archaeologists, Thoma, Fehrenbach, Wendorf, Stewart, Green, Armilagus, Wrightmore, Crawford, all of them prove that those early Egyptians in the Pyramid Age were African. That's the reason why Mokhtar, the Arab delegate, doesn't want a Negro nose on the Sphinx. Because they don't want to relate back. But the Germans sent me, I have it in my new book, you see a beautiful color photograph showing.
Let's interrogate that a bit. Carthage was a Phoenician colony. Its whole culture, language, religion, the reason it even existed, came from the entire Phoenician culture. And yet we're now told that within a few centuries, almost no actual Phoenician genetic trace remained, just the cultural shell. Instead, the population was largely made of locals, Sicilians, Sardinians, Iberians, and some North Africans from around Tunisia. So Carthage becomes this cosmopolitan melting pot of non-Phoenicians adopting Phoenician culture. Does that happen in history? Sure, assimilation and integration occur in colonies, but the extent to which they're claiming it happened is extraordinary. It's basically saying the Empire of Carthage was run by people who were mostly not Phoenician by blood. And oh, by the way, those people also weren't particularly African either. They were mostly Mediterranean Europeans. If your eyebrow is rising at that, you're not alone. It's weirdly convenient for certain narratives. It aligns with an old Eurocentric notion that even when a civilization is in Africa, if it was advanced and powerful, well, maybe that's because a bunch of whitish folks came in and ran the show. I'm not saying the authors explicitly claim that, but the subtext is there. They emphasize that North African ancestry, though present, was a minority in all sampled sites, even in Carthage itself, and that Carthaginian expansion had more to do with people from the European side of the Mediterranean than anyone from Africa or the Near East. To me, this reads like a smokescreen over the African elements. Why smokescreen? Because if you flood the narrative with talk of Sicilian and Aegean ancestry, you obscure any hint of, say, sub-Saharan African ancestry or a significant early Berber role. It's telling that they highlight every connection to Europe, even dragging in the Greek colonies in Cyrenaica, Libya, and on Sicily as potential gene flow sources, but they're pretty quiet about connections further south or deeper into Africa. We'll get to that omission soon, but ask yourselves, why are Harvard and Max Planck researchers so eager to prove that Carthaginians were basically Europeans in disguise? Why is it so important to show, look, they weren't Levantine Semites or particularly African, they were mostly like Sicilians, Greeks? It almost feels like they're trying to dethrone the Phoenicians from their own legacy and downplay Africa's role. Carthage, one of the greatest cities of antiquity, founded, legend says, by a Phoenician Queen Dido, goes on to challenge Rome itself, and now comes a paper implying A, ethnically they weren't really Phoenician after the first generation, and they weren't really African either, just local, Mediterranean folks with a Phoenician veneer. The authors even posed the question themselves, how on earth did Phoenician language and culture get adopted by people with no detectable Levantine ancestry? And their hypothesis is basically that, from day one, those crafty Phoenician colonists mixed with so many locals that within a century or two, the locals took over demographically. Well, I have a better explanation. The reason Carthage became the biggest and most numerous and most successful Phoenician colony is because they weren't rejected. And they weren't rejected because they were the same stock. The same way that when African Americans go to Ghana and South Africa today, they blend in so much they are accepted. The same way that Romans are more ready to accept Greek gods without modifying them too much. In the same way the Phoenicians were wholesome, accepted by the black Africans of early history Tunisia, because both groups were black. And it's easy to conclude because the archaeological evidence says so too. The cranium of early Phoenicians were what we call Nubio-Egypto-Negroid, and the early inhabitants of North Africa were what Greek historians tell us were Egyptians, or more precisely, very black people. And there's another piece of evidence from this paper that proves my accusation of their dishonesty, how they set up their comparisons in clusters, because there's a gargantuan shell game going on there. Alright, let's break down what their use of PCA leads to. But don't worry, I'll break it down. The study uses something called PCA, Principal Component Analysis, and other genetic clustering methods to analyze how these ancient individuals relate to various reference populations. Here's the thing. The references they chose were 1,196 present-day West Eurasian and North African individuals. Notice anything missing? Where are the black sub-Saharan Africans? Nowhere to be found. They deliberately did not include any clearly sub-Saharan African groups in their main PCA reference panel. North Africans, yes, but those are groups like Berbers or modern-day Northern Egyptians. Any ancient person with a bit of deeper African ancestry would not neatly cluster with any reference point because that axis doesn't account for it. At best, such a person would appear as a slight pull towards the North African end, since some North Africans have a small sub-Saharan component historically. In other words, if one of those Carthaginian skeletons had, hypothetically, 70 to 85% ancestry from, say, a sub-Saharan source, maybe via Nubian contacts or Saharan traders, the PCA would just show them as slightly more North African. It wouldn't scream, hey, this person has an unusual African component, because the comparative yardstick has been calibrated to miss it. That's the shell game. You set up the analysis in a way that certain outcomes, inconvenient ones, will be smoothed over. And sure enough, what do they report? They say the Punic individuals scatter broadly but largely overlap with the cluster of Bronze Iron Age Sicilians and Aegeans, with a narrow cline, a little gradient line of points, stretching toward Northwest African individuals. That cline includes things like Guanche, indigenous Canary Islanders, and an Iron Age Algerian sample, i.e., a slight pull toward Berber North African. So visually, on their plot, you've got a blob of points around the Sicilian, Greek area, and a thin tail heading a bit toward North Africa, but not reaching anywhere near sub-Saharan Africa, since there's no reference point for that anyway. Oh, and guess why the samples don't cluster closely with North Africans? Well, because modern-day North Africans are majority Arabs, and the Arabs, prior to 700 after Christ, they were not even in the region, so there is no way they could cluster to Carthage, who was there 1,000 years earlier. And by the way, Punic people. Really, say it out loud. Punic people. What does that even mean besides a neat way to blur faces in a crowd? Why are they using a term that denotes a war and that denotes an epoch and use it as if it denotes a whole people? I was so confused when I read the title of their paper, but the more I read, the more I understood why they chose this title. Their whole approach is an intentional diversion meant to create confusion and have you arrive at a set conclusion. Because when people hear Punic, they will think, oh, it's either the Romans or the Carthaginians. And if they say Punic people had no ancient Levantine genes, then they definitely didn't have any African genes. I see what you did there, but we won't fall for it. But ask yourself, what if some of those individuals did have significant African ancestry of a kind, not represented by coastal Berbers? Would the study have caught it or highlighted it? Given their setup, probably not clearly. In fact, earlier research in physical anthropology paint a rather different picture. Anthropologists studying Carthaginian-era skeletons have noted traits indicating tropical African ancestry, including sub-Saharan African traits in various Punic populations. One scholarly article by Nicholas Marquez Grant, 2005, explicitly discussed the presence of African individuals in Punic populations in places like Ibiza. In that study, they identified morphological features in some skeletons suggesting that those individuals had North African and sub-Saharan African ancestry. There's also an older analysis, Smith et al., 1990, of a Phoenician period skeleton from Israel that reportedly classified it as a black male based on cranial features. And get this, way back in 1924, the famed anthropologist Eugène Pittard noted that skulls of Phoenician remains found in Sicily were dolichocephalic and prognathouse, with distinctly negroid affinities. In plain language, elongated skulls, forward projecting jaws, traits commonly associated with black African populations. These findings have been out there in the literature for decades.
The most fantastic engineering ever done in the world until our present day were built by Africans.
Okay, these stone heads, were there any non-African stone heads?
There was one figure that was not as large as these. He was on a slab of stone, and he had a beard, and he had a headdress which showed him to be Phoenician. Now, the Phoenician figure is very important because both in the Egyptian world at that time, the Nubians, the black Nubians, were protecting the Phoenicians from the Assyrians. The Phoenicians had also moved. Princess Elisar had traveled with 300 Phoenicians down into North Africa, and they began intermarrying among black Africans in North Africa, just on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, from about 1000 BC.
Around 1,000 years before Christ, 3,000 years ago. It's such a long time ago, it's hard to even imagine. There were a people called the Phoenicians. These were Canaanite people that are mentioned in the Bible. They're a half Semitic and half something else. Who knows what they were? They were very well traveled. They were very great seafarers. And they employed all kinds of races on their ships because they didn't really have any particular homeland. They were always traveling, went everywhere. They were the first to go around Africa, known to go around Africa, 900 BC. And it's known that they employed many blacks on their ships, not as slaves. They had no slaves on board their ships. But they did have sailors. They did have captains.
In 1845, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard began excavations at Nimrud. On the second day, he uncovered the first ivories in the Northwest Palace. These in time would come to be known as the Nimrud ivories. The Nimrud ivories are believed to have been crafted by Phoenician artisans, as evidenced by Phoenician inscriptions on some pieces. They are said to date to the 8th to 6th century, so we are very late in the stream of the Phoenician civilization. Pretty much at the end. There are so many pieces that depict clearly phenotypically black people, like this feline feasting on a man. Clearly a black African with full complement of afro, luscious lips, and subnasal prognathism. Or again, this ivory carving of this young lady. You will notice here, too, that both the nose and the lips are missing, a pattern of historical vandalism. In summary, the PCA and admixture analyses were never designed to detect or emphasize a true black African presence. Look, I'm not accusing these scientists of outright fraud. Actually, I am. This is too blatant. It is too visible, and an article for them not to have proper methodology and proper inclusion of black African samples. And the research cohort is too large and too experienced for this to have been a mistake. One researcher recently noted there's a real investment in academia in trying to keep North Africa perceived as part of the white Mediterranean world, as white as possible. That bias seeps in quietly. So while they show us colorful PCA plots and bar graphs, I'm here to tell you, those visuals might not have been proof of what they are trying to conclude, but it's actually proof of their intent. And speaking of rigging the game, wait till you hear how they played with words and timelines. Words matter, especially in academia. And here we have a prime example of terminology as strategy. The word of the day, Punic. The authors of this study lean heavily on that term. It's in the title, all over the paper. They say Punic people to mean the folks in the Western Mediterranean who were part of the Carthaginian sphere from the 6th century BCE onward. They justify it by noting historians use Punic, from Latin poenis, meaning Phoenician, to distinguish Western Phoenician culture, Carthage, and its colonies, from the Eastern homeland. They even acknowledge that calling entire diverse communities Punic is a simplification and that scholars have pointed out problems with it. But they go ahead and use it anyway, with a specific definition, sites with Phoenician-derived culture in the central and western Mediterranean, roughly late 6th century BCE and later. Why is this a trick? Because by using Punic in this broad way, the authors get to blur important distinctions. When you hear the Punic people had almost no Levantine ancestors, you think the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, had no Levantine ancestors. That's certainly how many readers interpret it. But Hold on. The authors, in the fine print, say their use of Punic does not question the Levantine cultural origins of these people, nor whether the founders of sites like Carthage and Cádiz were Levantine. They simply have no samples from those founders. In other words, of course the founders were Phoenicians from the Levant. They admit that historically, but since they didn't sample those, they're going to label everyone they did sample, mostly later locals, as Punic, and talk about them collectively. And you know why they didn't sample ancient people from the Levant? Yep, because they already know who it is. If they had sampled them, then the Carthaginians would have clustered very closely to them, them being the black African stock they omitted. Shameful, really. Yet, here we are. By calling all their samples Punic people, the authors mask the difference between Phoenician colonists, the OGs, and the later locally born generations who had mixed with indigenous populations. They even explicitly note they aren't addressing whether Carthage's founders were Levantine. Well, if you're not addressing that, maybe don't publish a paper that leaves people thinking Carthage had no Levantine roots at all. Let's call it what it is, a branding exercise. Let's do a better job than them and actually provide the evidence that indicates what people the Carthaginians and the early Phoenicians were. In Figure 2 in that paper, they present their QP-ADM and mixture models, basically their best guess at how much ancestry from different source populations each individual had. They proudly display bars for each person or site, colored by source, things like Levantine, Bronze Age, Sicilian Aegean, Western Mediterranean, North African, Iron Age, even steppe and Iranian bits for completeness. They simplified some categories, like combining Sicily and Greece into one Aegean-like source, Iberia and Sardinia into one West Med source, etc. But notably, you won't see a bar for Egyptian or Nubian or anything explicitly representing the Nile-Valley civilizations. Why does that matter? Because Carthage did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of a web of African and Mediterranean trade routes and heritage. Carthaginians had dealings with Egypt. Carthage even allied with various Egyptian rulers at times against common enemies. Nubia, Kush, Meroe, south of Egypt, was another African civilization that was very much on the scene. There were also communities of people the Greeks and Romans called Ethiopians, meaning dark-skinned Africans, in parts of North Africa. The Garamantes of the Fezzan, Deep Sahara, traded with sub-Saharan regions. Simply put, the African side of the equation is more complex than one generic North African component. I really have to do an episode on the Garamantes, because the more we know about this people, the more you will understand that it is a corner piece to dismantle the ancient white Arab North African myth. Now let's go back to evidence that shows that Carthage and early Phoenicia was black. The kind that an independent truth seeker, like yours truly, looks at, and which this paper and its cheerleaders conveniently ignore. Because here's the thing, step outside the genomics bubble for a minute, and you'll find plenty of clues that Carthage and its people were not simply a bunch of transplanted Mediterraneans with a token local mix. There's a rich palette of historical, anthropological, and artistic evidence pointing to a strong African presence, yes, black African presence, in the Carthaginian realm from its very beginnings. Let's shine a light on a few of those clues. First up, physical anthropology, skeletal evidence. Decades before ancient DNA was a thing, anthropologists examined skulls and skeletons from Punic, Carthaginian era, cemeteries. What did they find? Diversity, including traits associated with sub-Saharan Africans. I mentioned earlier the work of Marquez Grant, 2005, in Ibiza, noting African traits. Going further back, Cheikh Anta Diop, the famous Senegalese scholar, cited studies of Phoenician remains in Sicily and Carthage that found Negroid features. Eugene Pittard, 1924, reported that skulls presumably Phoenician found near Syracuse, Sicily, were long-headed and prognathic, distinctly Negroid. He also noted that the Carthaginian aristocracy had notable African affinities. In Carthage, elite tombs contained skeletons that were almost all dolichocephalic, long-skulled, with rather short faces, which he observed are Negro characteristics. One of the most ornate tombs ever found in Carthage, the sarcophagus of a priestess of Tanit, Tanit was a top Carthaginian goddess, was examined by Pittard. The external sarcophagus art shows a dignified woman, likely an idealized image of the goddess or the priestess. But guess what? The woman buried there had Negro features. She belonged to the African race. Yes, you heard right. The highest of high society, a Carthaginian priestess, was identified as a black woman by a leading anthropologist of the time. These findings led Diop to conclude that while Carthage was multi-ethnic, the most esteemed and powerful group among those ethnicities was the black African group. That's a far cry from minority contributor, wouldn't you say? Modern scholars echo this earlier work. The French historian Gabriel Audicio, in 1961, flat out said, Hannibal was neither Phoenician, nor Carthaginian, nor Punic, but a North African. The majority of the Punic populace seems to have had African, indeed Negroid, ancestry. And he was no Afrocentrist. He was a mainstream French academic making that assessment from the evidence available. Even mainstream publications note these facts. The Wikipedia entry on Carthage acknowledges that Mediterranean, European-like elements were present in Carthaginian remains, but so were Mectoid, ancient North African features, and Negroid traits, and that Punic burials overall showed affinities with not just other Berber North Africans and Iberians, but also with Egyptians of the 18th dynasty and even West African linked groups. One noted historian of antiquity, Jehan de Sanges, stated, in the Punic burial grounds, Negroid remains were not rare, and there were black auxiliaries in the Carthaginian army who were certainly not Nilotics. Translation: black people were common enough in Carthage's cemeteries, and Carthage employed black troops, likely West Africans or others from south of the Sahara, not just Nile-Valley folks, as well. This is from a respected white French scholar, by the way, not a modern Afrocentric blog. And biological anthropologist Shomarka Keita published in 1990 a craniometric study of pre-Roman North African skulls, including 4th to 3rd century BC Carthaginian remains. He found they were heterogeneous, many clustered with equatorial African and ancient Egyptian series, and most had traits similar to those of ancient lower northern Egyptians. Let me repeat that. Shomarka Keita found that Carthaginian remains clustered with equatorial African and ancient Egyptian series, both groups which are distinctly black Africans. It cannot be true that all these findings are pointing to a black African origin of Carthage, while this paper omits to include black Africans in their samples. This is just beyond malpractice. Next, cultural and artistic evidence. Carthaginians and their Phoenician forebears depicted many things in their art. One fascinating piece often brought up is the so-called Hannibal coin. There's an ancient coin, minted in the Carthaginian sphere, possibly in Iberia, during the Second Punic War, which clearly depicts the great general Hannibal Barca. How do we know it's Hannibal? Well, because it has his elephant drawn on the other side of that coin. This is pretty much his signature. The face on that coin has certain features: curly, kinky hair, full lips, a broad nose, unmistakably black African. I mean, take a look and tell me this is a Viking. It also shows that Carthaginians didn't shy away from portraying themselves with African features. Another example, artifacts in the Western Phoenician colonies don't shy away from depicting African phenotypes. A terracotta bust from Cádiz, Spain, ancient Gadir, one of the oldest Phoenician colonies, founded approximately 1100 BCE, clearly shows a man with African features, short curly hair, a broad nose, thick lips. Spanish researchers explicitly describe it as a man of raza negra, black race. This bust dates to around 9th to 8th century BCE, meaning the early Phoenician colonists in Spain included black folks. Meanwhile, much later, Phoenician art from Cádiz, like the well-known marble sarcophagi of the 5th to 1st centuries BCE, show more Hellenistic European features. You can literally see the timeline of mixing in the art. The earliest colonists carved in stone look unmistakably African, while art, a few centuries later after intermarriage with locals and Greek influence, looks more European. That's exactly what we'd expect if the Phoenicians started out as black/African-derived people who gradually mixed with Europeans over time. So, they exported their culture and didn't exterminate the people. And archaeologists today are using this to say that the black people were never there. Let that sink in. And what about the Phoenicians back home in the Levant? The earliest iconography from Phoenicia, like an 8th century BC plaque found at Nimrud in Assyria, depicting a tribute bearer from Sidon, shows a man with black African features, so much so that researchers noted the kinky hair and full lips in the carving. The Phoenicians' own name might even hint at this. Some scholars, like historian Gavin de Beer, have suggested the Greek word phoinikes, Phoenicians, could mean dark-skinned. The usual explanation is it means purple, dye people, but it's interesting that the Greek root phoinos can mean reddish purple or dark. The point is, the Greeks, Egyptians, and others did not have a modern racial lens, but they described appearances. Egyptians often painted Asiatic, Levantine people with lighter brown or yellowish skin in art. Yet in one Egyptian tomb painting of Sebekotep, an official receiving tribute, the people labeled as coming from the Levant are painted in the same dark brown as Egyptians themselves, with dreadlock-like hairstyles to boot. I mean, look, from the bald heads to the dreadlocks. Strabo in the 1st century, BCE talks of a tribe south of Mauritania called the Farusi, who were like Ethiopians, and the Nazamones in Libya, who are black-skinned and have flat noses. Sounds like a description of a Sahelian or Sudanic African group. These sources place black populations in North Africa in antiquity. Tertullian, a native North African, Carthage, writing approximately 200 CE, said, "The complexion of the Gaetulians is somewhat dark, and of the Moors it is black." He used this as an analogy in a theological argument, but in doing so, he casually affirms that black-skinned people were part of his society's makeup. So from Carthage's own soil comes a statement that some of its neighbors were literally black. But stepping back, all these clues, the skulls, the quotes, the art, the names, are in plain sight. They all point to Carthage as an Afro-Mediterranean civilization, not a transplanted Europe in Africa. The Phoenicians who founded it were themselves likely Afro-Asiatic peoples with deep African roots. They settled in an African land, intermarried with indigenous Africans, Berbers, who themselves have some sub-Saharan connections, and even brought in people from further south as soldiers, explorers, traders. Then along comes this DNA study and poof, all that basically goes out the window in the headlines. They act as if none of that evidence exists. Harvard and Max Planck didn't mention Audizio's view, or Pittard's findings, or Marquez Grant's paper, or Keita's study in their article. They keep it narrowly on the DNA data, which, as I've explained, is designed in a way that could miss the African story. Carthage was founded around 814 BCE, or 9th century BCE, by Tyrian settlers. That's long before Persians or Alexander or Romans messed with Phoenicia. So Carthage's founders represented the original Phoenicians fairly well. After 500 BCE, the Persians conquered Phoenicia. After 332 BCE, Alexander did, then the Seleucid and Ptolemaic Greeks, then the Romans. Each wave likely changed the Levant's demographics. As Haber's genetic study on Lebanese showed, foreign admixture arrived in that period. But Carthage was independent through most of that. In a sense, Carthage might have preserved the older Phoenician genotype and culture even better than Phoenicia itself did by the late classical period. If that older genotype was more African, Carthage would show it. And indeed, the evidence indicates Carthaginians looked more like their African neighbors than, like, say, Persians or Greeks. They carried that African-derived torch proudly until Rome snuffed it out. So we have bones, coins, classical texts, and even Phoenician lore. Remember, they said they came from the Nile, all indicating a strong African element, including Black African, in the Carthaginian mix. The Nature paper's DNA sampling strategy manages to sidestep or downplay almost every one of those elements. Does that mean the paper is completely wrong? Not necessarily. The data it analyzed is what it is for those particular remains. But it's incomplete and was overgeneralized and above all cherry-picked. This is why you don't let a single study dictate historical truth, especially when it conflicts with a mountain of other evidence. It is telling that in their zeal to conceal the African origin of Carthage and the blackness of Hannibal, the authors of this paper have given us the best tool we could ever wish for in our fight for truth. They have given us evidence of their bias. The exclusion of the African stock from their sampling model is a perfect metaphor for what they wish the world to be, a world where black people are excluded, marginalized, and not seen. And if black people aren't counted in history, then they can claim all the spoils of the modern narrative. This will not fly anymore, because we will open the eyes of endless generations of Carthaginians who will take the second leg of the fight their ancestors started, a fight to modernize the world. Just like Carthage was the first civilization to utilize the principles of industrial productions with their ships, so too will a flotilla of truth speakers, from Mr. Imhotep to Camgiverse to King's Monologue, who will speak into our ears waves upon waves of healing truths, that our black skin, which shines like gold under the sun, is the source, and that, when you all join us, we will see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.
The study found their genetic profiles looked most like those of prehistoric inhabitants of Sicily. Woohoo!
That's the reason why Mokhtar, the Arab delegate, doesn't want a Negro nose on the Sphinx.
And it's known that they employed many blacks on their ships, not as slaves. They had no slaves on board their ships. But they did have sailors, they did have captains.
There are so many pieces that depict clearly phenotypically black people, like this feline feasting on a man.
Really? You had to wait for her to tell you to click the like button. Shame on you. Don't miss our previous episode on how the Kemetu used steam power to cut stone.